Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight we drift into the shadows of Peter Sutcliffe, the man the world would come to know as the Yorkshire Ripper. We begin our journey in the city of Leeds during the autumn of 1975. Imagine, if you will, the air of West Yorkshire at the end of October. It is a thick, damp atmosphere, heavy with the scent of coal smoke and the lingering industrial grit of a city that never quite feels clean. The streets of the Chapeltown district are lined with red brick terrace houses, their windows reflecting the amber glow of the old sodium streetlights. It is a world of deep shadows and long, narrow alleyways where the darkness seems to pool like ink. Breathe in that cool, evening air. Feel the stillness of the night as the city begins to settle into its uneasy rest. On the evening of October 29th, 1975, a young woman named Wilma McCann prepared to head out into the night. Wilma was only 28 years old, a mother of 4 young children who were the center of her world. Before she stepped out, she whispered a quiet goodnight to them, leaving her eldest daughter, who was only 9, to look after the little ones. Wilma was a woman with strawberry blonde hair and a spirit that sought a few hours of respite from the heavy burdens of her daily life. She walked through the streets she knew so well, past the familiar corners of Chapeltown, making her way toward the local pubs. The evening was unusually mild for late October, with the temperature hovering around 14 degrees, a soft breeze carrying the distant sounds of late-night traffic and the muffled laughter from inside the public houses. Wilma spent her night moving between the warm, crowded spaces of the Regent and the Royal Oak. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and tobacco, a comforting hum of conversation providing a backdrop to her evening. As the clocks moved past midnight and into the early hours of October 30th, she found herself at a club called Room at the Top. By the time she decided to head home, the city had grown much quieter. She carried a small tray of curry and chips, the warmth of the food a small comfort against the damp pavement. She was only a short distance from her home on Scott Hall Avenue, but the walk felt long in her tired state. She stood by the roadside, hoping for a lift, her figure illuminated briefly by the passing headlights of a few scattered cars. The night was silent now, save for the rhythmic clicking of her heels on the stone. It was then that a car pulled alongside her, a lime-green Ford Capri that stood out against the gray stone of the city. The driver was a man whose presence seemed unremarkable at first, just another face in the Leeds night. They drove a short distance to the Prince Philip playing fields, a wide expanse of grass situated near the Prince of Wales Park. The fields were a sea of deep green and shadowed gray under the moonlight, bordered by trees that stood like silent sentinels. The grass was dry, a rarity for a Yorkshire autumn, and the air held a peculiar stillness. It was here, in this quiet, open space only 100 yards from her own front door, that the nightmare began. The darkness of the park swallowed the sounds of the struggle, leaving only the rustle of the leaves and the distant, lonely whistle of the wind. As the sun began its slow ascent on the morning of October 30th, a local milkman began his usual rounds. The morning was gray and misty, the kind of light that softens the edges of the world. The electric hum of his milk float was the only sound in the sleepy neighborhood. As he moved near the playing fields, his eyes caught sight of something unusual on the embankment. At first, he thought it was a bundle of rags or perhaps a discarded guy for the upcoming bonfire night. But as he drew closer, the reality of the scene came into sharp, cold focus. There, lying on the grass, was the body of Wilma McCann. The sight was a jarring contrast to the peaceful morning. The bright strawberry blonde of her hair, the stillness of her form, and the devastating violence that had been visited upon her. The milkman stood frozen for a moment, the clink of glass bottles in his hands the only punctuation to the sudden, heavy silence of the park. The investigation that followed was immediate and intense. 150 police officers descended upon the area, cordoning off the playing fields where the grass had been trampled by the boots of investigators. They found that Wilma had been struck twice with a hammer and stabbed 15 times in the neck, chest, and abdomen. There was a clinical, haunting precision to the attack that sent a shiver through the local community. The police conducted 11,000 interviews, searching for the driver of a vehicle seen in the area, yet the killer remained a ghost, a shadow that had retreated back into the industrial fog of West Yorkshire. At the time, no one knew that this was not an isolated tragedy, but the beginning of a 5-year reign of terror. The city of Leeds, usually so vibrant and resilient, felt a new, cold weight settling over its streets. A shadow had fallen over the north, and the peace of the evening had been shattered by a darkness that refused to fade. The winter of 1975 did not simply end. It seemed to solidify, turning the rain-slicked streets of Leeds into mirrors of dark, cold glass. As the calendar turned to 1976, the industrial heart of West Yorkshire remained gripped by a biting wind that rattled the window panes of the back-to-back terrace houses in Chapeltown. There was a particular stillness in the air during those early January nights, a silence that felt heavy, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The orange glow of the sodium street lamps struggled to pierce the thick, coal-scented fog that often rolled in from the surrounding hills, casting long, distorted shadows against the soot-stained brickwork. In this atmosphere of economic hardship and gray, low-hanging clouds, the investigation into the death of Wilma McCann had begun to settle into a frustrating rhythm of unanswered questions and cold leads. On the evening of January 20, 1976, the cold was especially sharp. Emily Jackson, a 42-year-old mother of 3, stood outside the Gaiety pub on Roundhay Road. She was a woman known for her warmth and her devotion to her family, but the harsh financial realities of the mid-70s had pushed her and her husband, Sidney, to a desperate decision. As Sidney waited inside the warmth of the pub, Emily stepped out into the freezing night to find a way to make ends meet. The street was quiet, save for the occasional hiss of tires on wet pavement. A vehicle slowed, a brief exchange of words was muffled by the wind, and Emily climbed inside, leaving the familiar lights of the Gaiety behind. She did not know that she had just stepped into the path of a predator who was now moving with a terrifying, practiced confidence through the streets of Leeds. The driver took her just half a mile away, into the shadows of the Manor industrial estate on Enfield Terrace. It was a place of derelict buildings and rusted gates, where the silence was absolute. There, under the cover of a darkness that the city lights could not reach, the violence returned. It was brutal and sudden. Emily was struck twice on the back of the head with a hammer, a signature that was becoming a dark hallmark of these attacks. But the perpetrator did not stop there. In a frenzied escalation of cruelty, he used a sharpened Phillips screwdriver to inflict 52 wounds across her body. When the sun rose on the morning of January 21, a workman taking a shortcut through the yard found her. The sight was one of utter devastation, yet among the horror, the killer had left a single, chillingly clear clue: the impression of a boot on Emily's skin. Forensic teams would later identify it as a Dunlop Warwick, size 7 or 8, a common work boot that offered a frustratingly broad profile for the police to follow. Detective Chief Superintendent Dennis Hoban, a man of sharp instincts and tireless dedication, immediately saw the connections. The method of the attack, the choice of weapon, and the location all mirrored the murder of Wilma McCann from 3 months prior. A pattern was emerging, one that suggested the killer was not a passing traveler, but someone who knew the labyrinthine streets of Leeds intimately. Hoban's team worked 18 hours a day, sorting through thousands of statements, but the shadow was growing longer. The local newspapers began to carry a new tone of urgency, and the residents of Chapeltown began to look at their neighbors with a growing, unspoken suspicion. Every slamming car door or distant footfall on the pavement now carried the weight of potential danger. As spring attempted to break through the Yorkshire gloom, the violence shifted slightly in geography, but not in nature. On the night of May 9, 1976, 20-year-old Marcella Claxton was walking home from a late-night party in Chapel Town. The air was milder, but the streets felt no safer. When a man in a white car pulled over and offered her a lift, she accepted, hoping to escape the fatigue of the long walk. He drove her to the edge of Roundhay Park, a vast expanse of greenery that felt desolate and eerie in the early hours of the morning. Near a cluster of trees, the man attacked. He struck her over the head with a hammer, leaving her for dead on the grass. But Marcella was a survivor. Despite her horrific injuries, which would eventually require over 50 stitches to her head, she managed to crawl to a phone box and call for help. Tragically, the physical assault resulted in the loss of her unborn child. A devastating layer of grief added to an already senseless act of violence. Marcella provided the police with a detailed description of her attacker, a white man with a dark beard and a distinctive gaze. However, in a failure of the system that would haunt the investigation for years, her testimony was largely dismissed. Because she had survived, and because of the location of the attack, investigators struggled to link her experience to the murders of Wilma and Emily. They viewed her through a lens of bias, failing to see that the monster they were hunting had stood directly in front of her. This missed opportunity allowed the cold wind of 1976 to carry the killer forward into the coming months, his anonymity preserved by the very institutions meant to stop him. The pattern was there, etched in the dirt and the blood of the city, but for now, it remained a puzzle with pieces that the authorities simply refused to fit together. The summer of 1977 did not bring the usual relief of warm breezes to the people of West Yorkshire. Instead, the heat felt heavy, a stagnant blanket that seemed to trap the growing fear within the narrow, winding streets of Leeds and Bradford. By this time, the shadow of the man the press had begun to call the Yorkshire Ripper had already fallen across several lives. But the summer of 1977 was the moment the terror truly settled into the bones of the community. It was a time of heavy footsteps, both real and imagined, echoing through the dark as the sun dipped behind the silhouettes of the old Victorian mills. The air was filled with the scent of hot asphalt and the distant, rhythmic hum of the city, but beneath it all was a desperate, collective holding of breath. Every woman walking home alone felt the weight of the silence, a silence that was no longer peaceful, but predatory. On a Saturday night in late June, 16-year-old Jane MacDonald stepped out for an evening of music and laughter. She was a shop assistant, full of the vibrant energy of youth, wearing a gingham skirt and platform shoes that clicked rhythmically against the pavement. She had spent the evening at a German-style beer cellar in the city center, dancing and talking with friends, unaware that the clock was ticking toward a tragedy that would change the course of the entire investigation. When she missed her last bus, the walk home through the familiar streets of Chapeltown became a journey into the mouth of a nightmare. The sounds of her own shoes, once cheerful, now seemed to draw the attention of the shadows. In a small adventure playground, the violence that had been stalking the north found her. The discovery of her body the next morning shattered the police's narrow profile of the victims. Because Jane was so young and considered by the authorities as a person of innocent standing, the public was forced to confront a terrifying reality. The killer was not just targeting a specific group. He was a predator in the truest sense, and no one was safe. The death of Jane MacDonald acted as a lightning bolt through the heart of the West Yorkshire police. The pressure from the public and the national press became an unbearable weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the investigators. It was at this point that Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield took personal command of the hunt. He was a man of traditional methods, a detective who believed in the power of tireless legwork and the absolute weight of physical files. He stood before the cameras and promised the people of Yorkshire that this monster would be caught. But behind the scenes, the sheer scale of the task was beginning to overwhelm the department. The investigation moved its headquarters to the Milgarth police station in Leeds, a building that would soon become a labyrinth of paper. The detectives worked in rooms where the air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and the constant, frantic clatter of typewriters. They were looking for a single thread in a tapestry of thousands, a needle in a haystack that was growing larger with every passing hour of that sweltering summer. Only 2 weeks after the city mourned for Jane, the heavy footsteps returned. On a Sunday morning in July, 42-year-old Maureen Long left a nightclub in Bradford, her long evening dress trailing slightly as she searched for a way home. The night was humid, the industrial outskirts of the city cast in deep, ink-black shadows. When a man in a car offered her a lift, the promise of safety was a lie. He drove her to a desolate, unlit lane, a place where the cobbles felt cold and slick underfoot. The attack was swift and brutal, a repetition of the horror that had come before. Yet Maureen Long was a fighter. Despite the gravity of her injuries, she survived, becoming one of the few who could speak of the man in the darkness. She remembered the footsteps, the heavy, purposeful sound of a man who believed he had finished his work. Her survival offered a glimmer of hope, a potential breakthrough, but the description of the car she gave would lead the police down a winding path of thousands of checks that ultimately failed to find the right vehicle. Inside the incident room at Milgarth, the mechanics of the investigation were a monument to the limitations of the era. This was a world before computers, where every piece of information was recorded on a small index card. There were hundreds of thousands of them, organized in vast wooden trays that lined the walls. Detectives spent their days and nights cross-referencing names, addresses, and car registrations, their eyes blurring under the harsh fluorescent lights. The floorboards of the station actually had to be reinforced with steel beams because the weight of the paper and the cabinets had become so immense. It was a physical manifestation of the data overload that was paralyzing the hunt. Every time a new witness came forward or a new lead was followed, another card was added to the mountain. Somewhere in those trays, the name of the killer was already written, filed away under a layer of administrative dust, waiting to be connected to the blood on the streets. As the summer of 1977 began to fade into a restless autumn, the sense of urgency within the police force reached a fever pitch. They were haunted by the knowledge that the man they sought was still moving through the crowds, perhaps even watching them from the periphery. The heavy footsteps that had echoed through the nights of Leeds and Bradford were not just a memory. They were a promise of more violence to come. The thread of evidence remained elusive, a ghost in the machine of the paper-heavy investigation. The city remained in a state of high alert, the windows barred and the doors locked tight as the residents waited for a sign that the nightmare was ending. But for now, the shadows remained long, and the path to the truth was buried deep beneath a million handwritten words. The hunt continued, driven by the echoes of the feet that moved unseen through the Yorkshire night, leaving the investigators to wonder how many more names would be added to their files before the sun finally rose on a safer world. The air in Manchester during the first few days of October, 1977, carried a biting, damp edge that seemed to cling to the soot-stained brickwork of the city. For years, the terror had been a Yorkshire concern, a shadow lurking in the valleys and mills of Leeds and Bradford. But on the 1st of October, the darkness crossed the Pennines. Jean Jordan, a young mother who had traveled from Scotland to seek a new life, met a man in the Moss Side district. She would never return home. Her body was left in a quiet, overgrown allotment near the Southern Cemetery in Chorlton-cum-Hardy. For 9 days, she lay there in the long grass, while life in the city continued its indifferent pulse just beyond the perimeter fence. It was a place of silence and neglect, where the only movement was the swaying of weeds in the cold Manchester wind. As the days passed, a strange and terrible thing happened. The killer, back in his home in Bradford, was consumed not by remorse, but by a cold, calculating panic. He realized he had made a mistake, a single, careless act that could lead the police directly to his door. He had given Jean a brand-new £5 note, and his mind fixated on its crisp, uncirculated surface. He knew that such a note could be traced. On the 9th of October, while his family believed he was preparing for a housewarming party, he drove back to Manchester in the dead of night. He returned to the scene of his crime, searching the body and the surrounding earth with a frantic desperation. When he could not find the note, his fear turned into a savage, blind rage. He mutilated the remains of his victim, a horrific expression of his frustration, before vanishing back into the shadows of the motorway. The discovery of the body was finally made on the morning of the 10th of October. A local man, searching for bricks to build a shed on his allotment, stumbled upon the scene. The investigation that followed was unlike any Manchester had seen. Chief Superintendent Jack Ridgway took command, and 5 days later, his team found what the killer had missed. Tucked away in a small, hidden zip compartment of Jean's handbag, found nearly 200 feet from where she lay, was the very thing that had brought the murderer back to the site. It was a pristine £5 note, untouched by the rain or the carnage. It was as if it had been waiting in the dark to tell its story. The detectives handled it with a reverence usually reserved for relics, sensing that this slip of paper was the most significant clue they had ever possessed. The note was a Bank of England issue with the serial number Alpha Whiskey 51 121 565. Within 48 hours, the police had tracked its journey. It had been part of a large consignment sent to the Midland Bank branches in Shipley and Bingley, just outside of Bradford. This was a virgin note, part of a payroll batch intended for local workers. The scope of the task was immense. The police narrowed their focus to 28 companies that had received these specific notes to pay their employees for the weekend of the murder. It was a monumental undertaking, an administrative hunt through the industrial heart of the North. They were looking for one man out of thousands, a needle in a haystack of ledger books and time cards, following the paper trail through the soot and the steam. This became known as the £5 note inquiry. For months, detectives moved through the grease and noise of the Yorkshire transport yards and engineering firms. They interviewed over 5,000 men, each one a face across a desk in a cramped, temporary office. They were looking for a driver, someone who moved between the cities, someone who was familiar with the dark stretches of the road. Among the list of companies was a haulage firm called T and W.H. Clark. The officers arrived there in November, carrying their clipboards and their questions. They were tired, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data, but they were methodical. They were closing in on a list of workers who had been paid with that specific batch of currency, and the atmosphere in the yard was heavy with the scent of diesel and the weight of suspicion. On the 2nd of November, 1977, 2 detectives sat in a modest home in Bradford. Across from them sat Peter Sutcliffe. He was a quiet, dark-haired man who worked as a driver for the Clark firm. He appeared remarkably calm, even helpful. When asked about his movements on the night of the murder, he provided a simple, solid alibi. He claimed he had been at home, and when questioned about the night the killer returned to the body, he mentioned the housewarming party. His wife and his mother both confirmed his story with unwavering certainty. The detectives looked at this unremarkable man, a hardworking driver with a steady job, and saw no reason to doubt him. He was just another number on their list, one of the thousands who had handled a £5 note that week. They made a brief note in their files, closed their folders, and walked out into the cold evening air. The tragedy of the inquiry lay in the stacks of paper that grew higher every day in the police headquarters. The floorboards of the incident room had to be reinforced with steel to hold the weight of the files. Somewhere in that mountain of information, the truth was buried, but it was obscured by the sheer scale of the search. The investigators were so focused on the trail of the money that they missed the man standing right in front of them. Sutcliffe had been interviewed, his name recorded, and his alibi accepted. He had survived the closest brush with justice he had ever faced. As the winter of 1977 tightened its grip, the 5-pound note inquiry began to lose its momentum, eventually grinding to a halt. The killer was left to the silence of his cab, driving the long, dark routes of the north, while the shadow of the Ripper grew longer over the land. The north of England in the late 1970s was a landscape defined by its industry and its silent resilience. Imagine, if you will, the narrow streets of Leeds and Bradford, where the red brick of the terraced houses was stained dark by decades of coal smoke and factory soot. The air often carried the scent of damp wool and old machinery, a heavy, metallic mist that seemed to cling to the skin. Above, the sky was a permanent shade of charcoal gray, occasionally broken by the orange, flickering glow of the new sodium street lamps. These lights cast long, distorted shadows against the cobblestones, turning every alleyway into a tunnel of uncertainty. It was within this gray, industrial heartland that a specific kind of darkness began to take root, a shadow that did not just disappear when the sun rose, but lingered in the minds of every person who walked those cold, wet streets. As the evening light faded behind the jagged peaks of the Pennines, a transformation would occur across the towns of West Yorkshire. The bustling energy of the daytime, filled with the clatter of clogs and the rumble of delivery trucks, would give way to an eerie, pressurized silence. By the time the clock struck 6 in the evening, the streets began to empty with a mechanical precision. You could hear the distant, lonely hum of the motorway, the great concrete artery that connected these cities, but on the local level, the soundscape was reduced to the sharp, quick rhythm of footsteps on wet pavement. People no longer lingered at their garden gates or chatted on street corners. The cold air of the late 70s was filled with a sense of urgency, a collective rush to be on the right side of a locked door before the true night fell, and the thick, yellow fog rolled in from the hills. The authorities, struggling to find a thread in the growing mountain of evidence, turned their efforts toward the public with advice that felt like a surrender. Throughout the late 1970s, the police issued warnings that effectively placed half the population under a voluntary curfew. Headlines in the Yorkshire Evening Post and posters in shop windows delivered a singular, haunting message. Women should not go out at night unless it was absolutely necessary, and even then, only if they were accompanied by a man they knew and trusted. It was an instruction that felt like a retreat, a public admission that the streets no longer belonged to the people who lived on them. For many women, this directive was not just a safety precaution. It was a cage, a social confinement that turned the simple act of walking to a bus stop into an act of profound bravery or terrifying risk. Think of the texture of that fear. It was the feeling of a heavy coat collar pulled high against the neck, a physical barrier against the biting northern wind and the gaze of strangers. Women described walking in the very middle of the road, far from the deep shadows of doorways and the overhanging branches of garden hedges, so they could have a clear view in every direction. The sound of a car slowing down behind you was no longer just a nuisance. It was a reason to catch your breath, to feel your heart hammer against your ribs. Every man in a heavy parka or a flat cap became a potential figure of dread. This was not a sudden, sharp panic, but a slow, grinding exhaustion that wore down the spirit of the community. The simple joys of a late-night film or a dance at the local hall were replaced by the cold reality of the deadbolt and the heavy iron latch on the door. But within this silence, a different kind of sound began to rise. In November of 1977, the frustration finally boiled over into the streets of Leeds. The first reclaim the night marches were born from a refusal to accept the status quo of fear. Imagine hundreds of women gathered at Chapeltown and Woodhouse Moor, their faces illuminated by the orange flicker of flaming torches held high against the autumn chill. They did not march in silence. They chanted and sang, their voices echoing off the brick walls of the city, demanding the right to walk safely without the shadow of a predator looming over them. Their banners read, "No curfew on women, curfew on men," a powerful inversion of the police advice that had for years placed the burden of safety on the victims rather than the perpetrator. It was a moment of fierce, collective light in an era defined by its growing and oppressive industrial darkness. Despite these flickers of resistance, the atmosphere of the towns remained heavy. The social fabric of the North was fraying at the edges. The local pubs, once the warm and noisy hearts of the neighborhood, saw their evening crowds dwindle. Working men's clubs would end their sessions with an announcement from the stage, reminding the women present to make sure they traveled home together or with someone they trusted. There was a strange, hollowed-out feeling to the nightlife. Taxis were in high demand, but even the act of getting into a car with a stranger carried a new, jagged edge of suspicion. The cities were in a state of unofficial lockdown, a psychological siege where the walls were made of brick and the weapons were the long nights of a northern winter. Every time a new attack was reported, the invisible walls of the curfew seemed to grow even thicker. Paranoia began to seep under the doors of ordinary homes. Neighbors who had known each other for years began to look at one another with a flickering doubt. If the killer was an ordinary man, a man with a job and a car and a family, then who could be ruled out? The police had interviewed thousands of men, including the killer himself on multiple occasions, and yet the pattern continued. This created a profound sense of isolation. You were not just afraid of the dark. You were afraid of the person living 3 doors down, or the man standing next to you in the queue at the local shop. The collective trust that holds a community together was being eroded by the persistent, unanswered threat that haunted the industrial valleys of the North, leaving every household to manage its own quiet terror behind closed curtains. We leave the cities now, bathed in that dim sodium light, as the sirens of the late 1970s continue to wail in the distance. The women of the North remained vigilant, their lives forever altered by a period of history where the simple act of breathing the night air was a form of defiance. The investigation remained a labyrinth of paper and missed opportunities, but the social landscape had been permanently scarred. As we move closer to the turn of the decade, the pressure on the West Yorkshire police would reach a breaking point, and the focus would shift from the streets to the heart of the machine itself. For now, the rain continues to fall on the red brick, and the shadows remain long and deep. The city sleeps with one eye open, waiting for a dawn that feels many years away. The year is 1979. The air in West Yorkshire is thick with more than just the usual industrial soot and the smell of cooling rain on pavement. There is a psychological fog that has settled over the north of England, a heavy, suffocating weight that makes every footstep behind you on a dark street sound like a countdown. For 4 long years, the phantom has eluded the shadows. The police are tired. George Oldfield, the assistant chief constable, is more than tired. He is a man being consumed by the case from the inside out. He lives on a precarious diet of Scotch whiskey and cough mixture, his chest rattling with a chronic cough as he stares at the mounting maps and the thousands of index cards that seem to offer no answers. The investigation at the Millgarth police station is a labyrinth of paper, a sea of white cards that have yet to reveal a pattern. The public is terrified, and the pressure from the government in London is reaching a fever pitch. It is into this atmosphere of desperation and exhaustion that a small, unassuming brown envelope arrives, carrying with it a voice that would change the course of history for all the wrong reasons. The envelope is postmarked from Sunderland, a city 78 miles to the north of the primary search area. It is addressed personally to George Oldfield. Inside, wrapped in a thin layer of protection, is a small cassette tape. Imagine the scene in that cramped, dimly lit office. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the distant chime of a typewriter, and the silence that falls as Oldfield presses the heavy plastic button of a desktop recorder. There is a soft, mechanical click, followed by the hiss of magnetic tape moving across a playback head. For a few seconds, there is only white noise, a crackling static that sounds like the wind across a desolate moor. And then a voice emerges. It is a man's voice, low and taunting, carrying the unmistakable melodic lilt of a Wareside accent. "I am Jack," the voice says. "I see you are still having no luck catching me." The words are clear, delivered with a chilling confidence that seems to vibrate through the speakers. "I have the greatest respect for you, George," the voice continues, "but Lord, you are no nearer to catching me now than 4 years ago when I started." The message lasts for just over 2 minutes. The man on the tape mocks the police, suggesting that the rank-and-file officers are letting their commander down. He mentions specific details, claiming he was nearly caught in the Chapeltown area of Leeds just a few months prior, only to be saved by the incompetence of a uniform copper. The voice is calm, almost conversational, which makes the malice behind it feel even more intimate. As the tape nears its end, a strange and haunting addition fills the room. The man has recorded a snippet of a popular song, "Thank You for Being a Friend" by Andrew Gold. The upbeat, cheerful melody clashes horribly with the context of the recording, creating a surreal and grotesque juxtaposition that lingers in the air long after the tape stops spinning. For George Oldfield, this was not just a piece of evidence, it was a personal challenge. He became convinced, with a certainty that bordered on the religious, that this was the voice of the man who had been terrorizing the North. He believed the Ripper had finally reached out to him, one professional to another, to play a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Why was Oldfield so certain? It wasn't just the taunting tone. There had been letters before the tape, also postmarked from Sunderland in March of 1978 and March of 1979. These letters mentioned a murder that the police believed was a secret known only to the killer and the authorities. The 1975 killing of Joan Harrison in Preston. The letters claimed responsibility for her death, and because the police had wrongly linked her murder to the Ripper's series of crimes, the mention of her name served as a grim validation. They believed the writer was authentic because he knew about Joan. What they didn't realize at the time was that the details of the Harrison case had actually been published in local newspapers years earlier. The hoaxer had simply done his research. But in the heat of a failing investigation, this connection felt like a breakthrough. The police brought in dialect experts like Stanley Ellis, who listened to the tape hundreds of times, eventually pinpointing the accent to the Castletown area of Sunderland. This was the moment the trap was set, not for the killer, but for the police themselves. The search for the Yorkshire Ripper was immediately and drastically diverted. A massive publicity campaign was launched, costing over £1 million. They called it Project R. 5,000 advertising hoardings were erected across the country, and 300 newspapers carried the handwriting from the letters. Most famously, a Dial the Ripper hotline was established, allowing members of the public to call in and listen to the voice on the tape to see if they recognized it. Thousands of men in the Northeast were interviewed, and their voices were compared to the recording. The police mandated that any suspect who did not have a Sunderland accent should be moved to the bottom of the priority list. It was a fatal filter. In the shadows of Bradford, Peter Sutcliffe continued his daily life, driving his lorry and returning to his wife. He was interviewed by the police multiple times during this period. On one occasion, a detective even noted that his physical appearance and his car's movements closely matched the profile of the killer. But when the report reached the higher-ups, it was discarded. Why? Because Peter Sutcliffe spoke with a soft, gentle West Yorkshire accent. He didn't sound like the man on the tape. He wasn't a Geordie. Therefore, in the eyes of the command center, he couldn't be the Ripper. Sutcliffe himself would later admit that the arrival of the tape was like a gift from above. While the police were pouring their energy and resources into the streets of Sunderland, hundreds of miles away from the true center of the crimes, he felt a sense of divine protection. He knew the police were looking for a ghost in a different city, a man with a different voice. This distraction allowed him to walk free for another 18 months. During that time, the voice on the tape remained the primary focus, despite warnings from the American Federal Bureau of Investigation. Expert profilers across the Atlantic had listened to the recording and warned the British authorities that it was a blatant hoax, the work of a man seeking notoriety rather than a confession. But George Oldfield would not listen. He had staked his reputation, his health, and the safety of the public on that small cassette tape. He was trapped in a tunnel of his own making, and the light at the end was only a train. As we move into the final years of the decade, the tragedy of the tape becomes clear. It wasn't just a diversion. It was a death sentence for the women who would cross Sutcliffe's path while the police were busy listening to the lilt of a Sunderland ghost. The air in the interview rooms of West Yorkshire was often thick with the scent of heavy wool coats and the metallic tang of cold tea. It was a space where time seemed to stretch, measured only by the rhythmic clicking of a pen or the hum of a distant radiator. In this chapter, we find ourselves in those very rooms, listening to voices that should have changed everything. Previously, we spoke of the hoaxer's tape, a voice from Sunderland that held the police in a trance. But while that recording played in the offices of high-ranking detectives, other voices were speaking. These were the voices of the living, women who had looked into the eyes of the predator and survived. They brought with them descriptions that were sharp and accurate, yet they found themselves speaking into a vacuum of disbelief. Consider the memory of Marcella Claxton. It was May of 1976, a night when the world was supposed to be quiet. She had been walking home when a car slowed beside her. She described a man with dark, wavy hair and a neatly trimmed beard. She had seen him clearly. More importantly, she had heard him. When he spoke, it was not the coastal cadence of the Northeast. It was the familiar lilt of Yorkshire, the same vowels she heard every day in the markets of Leeds. After her ordeal, she offered the authorities a photofit that captured the predator with precision. But at that time, the investigation was bound by narrow definitions. Because Marcella did not fit their specific profile of a victim, some within the force hesitated to link her attack. Her testimony was filed away, a piece of a puzzle they refused to assemble. A year and a half later, in December of 1977, the pattern repeated with Marilyn Moore. In the biting cold of a Leeds evening, she encountered a man who called himself Dave. Like Marcella before her, Marilyn was left with a detailed image etched into her mind. She spoke of a man about 5 feet 7 inches tall, stocky, with a mustache that reminded her of the television character Jason King, thick and dark. She even noted the distinct gap between his front teeth. Her description was a mirror of the one provided by Marcella Claxton. The investigators noted the similarities in the signature hammer blows. Yet, even as the physical evidence and the survivors' memories pointed toward a local man, the gravitational pull of the hoaxer's tape was taking hold. The investigators were looking for a ghost with a Geordie accent, and anything that did not match that recording was treated as a distraction. The linguistic divide was perhaps the most tragic missed opportunity. Experts like Stanley Ellis had already begun to whisper warnings that the voice on the tape was a cruel distraction. But in the incident room at Milgarth, the floor had to be reinforced just to hold the weight of the paper, the mountains of files that catalogued thousands of men. Amidst this paper forest, the survivors continued to insist on what they had heard. Olive Smelt, who had been attacked in Halifax back in 1975, was adamant. She knew the sounds of her own neighbors. She knew the way a man from the West Riding shaped his words. To her, there was no doubt the man was a local. But to the detectives, she was simply mistaken. They believed the trauma had clouded her hearing. They chose to trust a piece of plastic tape over the living witness. Peter Sutcliffe himself would later express his own amazement at how the system shielded him. He was interviewed 9 separate times over the course of the hunt. On 4 of those occasions, the interviews took place after the police had decided that the killer must be a man from Sunderland. Each time, the officers sat across from him, noted his calm demeanor, and then checked one specific box. Did he have the accent? Because Sutcliffe spoke with the soft tones of Shipley and Bingley, he was dismissed. He was a Yorkshireman, and in the minds of the lead investigators, the Ripper was a man of the Northeast. This tunnel vision was enforced by official memos. Detectives were instructed to disregard any suspect who did not sound like the tape. It was a fatal filter that allowed the true predator to walk back out of the station doors 9 separate times. The investigators were fighting their own expectations. George Oldfield had anchored the entire weight of the police to a voice that did not exist in the real scenes of the crimes. As the months turned into years, the voices of the survivors grew fainter, drowned out by the mechanical hiss of the hoax tape. 3 more lives would be lost in the wake of that recording, while the detectives waited for a Geordie who would never come. The truth was there all along, spoken in the local dialect of the victims and captured in the photofits that sat in dusty files. The hunt continued, blind to the reality in front of them, as the shadow in the driver's seat of a brown Ford Corsair continued to move through the dark, invisible precisely because he sounded exactly like home. The year is 1979, and we find ourselves inside the heavy, soot-stained walls of Millgarth Police Station in Leeds. Imagine, if you will, the atmosphere of this place. It is a building that never sleeps, thick with the scent of stale tobacco, floor wax, and the metallic tang of old radiator steam. In the heart of this station lies the infamous Ripper Room. It is a space defined by a peculiar, crushing silence, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of typewriters and the sliding scrape of heavy metal drawers. Here, the investigation has transformed into something far more tangible and cumbersome than a mere manhunt. It has become a battle against the sheer weight of information. Outside, the night air is cold and damp, but inside, the air is stagnant, heavy with the dust of thousands upon thousands of paper records. This is where the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper has stalled, not for a lack of effort, but because the very scale of the search has begun to consume the searchers. We are drifting now through the narrow aisles of filing cabinets, where the truth is hidden in plain sight, buried under the mountains of manual labor. The physical reality of this room is almost impossible to grasp by modern standards. There are no computer screens flickering in the dim light, no digital databases to search with the stroke of a key. Instead, there is paper. Millions of pages of statements, observations, and vehicle registrations have accumulated over the last 4 years. The volume of this documentation is so immense that the authorities had to take a drastic, almost surreal measure. The floor of the incident room began to sag under the literal weight of the files. To prevent a catastrophic structural failure, engineers had to be called in to install massive steel girders beneath the floorboards, shoring up the building so it would not collapse under the burden of its own evidence. It is a haunting image, isn't it? A police station literally groaning under the pressure of its failures. Every index card added to the pile was another fraction of an inch of descent, a physical manifestation of an investigation that was sinking into its own complexity. The information was there, pressing down on the foundation of the law, yet it remained silent and unlinked. At the center of this administrative labyrinth was the card index. Each suspect, each witness, and each vehicle was meticulously recorded on a 5 by 8-inch card. The system was divided into 3 primary categories: names, vehicles, and locations. In theory, this triple index was designed to catch a killer by finding the common thread between these 3 points. But in practice, the system was a victim of its own success. There were over 300,000 names recorded in these cabinets. Thousands of officers were feeding information into the room, but the clerks, working long and exhausting shifts, could not keep up with the cross-referencing. If a man was interviewed in Bradford and then seen in a car in Leeds, the cards recording these two events might sit in different drawers, separated by hundreds of feet of steel and paper, never to be reconciled. This was the administrative fog where the Ripper lived. He was not a ghost. He was a series of ink marks on white cardboard, scattered across a room that had grown too large for any human mind to navigate. The sound of those drawers opening and closing was the pulse of a machine that had lost its way. One of the most promising clues in the entire investigation was a brand new £5 note. It had been found in the secret pocket of a handbag belonging to Jean Jordan, a victim found in Manchester in 1977. The note was crisp, its serial number traceable to a specific batch issued to firms in the Shipley and Bingley areas for their weekly payroll. This lead was a lightning bolt of hope for the investigators. They narrowed the list of potential recipients down to 8,000 men. Among those 8,000 was a local truck driver named Peter Sutcliffe. On the 2nd of November 1977, 2 officers knocked on his door. He was calm, almost bored, as he invited them in. He provided an alibi, claiming he had been at a family party on the night in question. His wife, Sonia, confirmed his story. The officers noted his cooperation and left, filing a short, 5-paragraph report that was eventually turned into yet another index card. That card was placed in the system, one of many, a needle tucked carefully into a haystack of terrifying proportions. He had been spoken to, he had been measured against the evidence, and he had simply faded back into the background noise of the city. This was not the only time the authorities crossed paths with him. Over the course of the investigation, he was interviewed on 9 separate occasions. 9 times, police officers sat in his presence, looked into his eyes, and listened to his soft Yorkshire accent. They spoke to him about the £5 note. They spoke to him about his car, a Sunbeam Rapier, which had been spotted dozens of times in the red light districts of Leeds and Bradford. During one interview, he was even wearing a pair of boots that closely matched the distinctive tread pattern found at a crime scene. But the officers were looking for a man with a Geordie accent, a man from the Northeast, because they had become obsessed with the hoax letters and the tape recording sent by the figure known as Wareside Jack. Because this man sitting before them did not sound like the voice on the tape, he was often moved down the list of priorities. The administrative overload meant that the reports from these various interviews were rarely compared side by side. The officer from the 5th interview didn't necessarily know what the officer from the 2nd interview had discovered. The left hand of the law did not know what the right hand was writing on its index cards. There was one officer, a young detective named Andrew Laptew, who felt a deep, nagging suspicion after speaking with the driver. He noted the man's physical resemblance to the composite sketches and felt there was something unsettled in his demeanor. Laptew submitted a detailed report, explicitly suggesting that this individual should be investigated more thoroughly. But in the grand, chaotic engine of Milgarth, that report was just another piece of paper added to the crushing weight on the floor. It was processed, filed, and forgotten. The system had become so bloated that it prioritized the act of filing over the act of solving. The tragedy of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation is often told through the lens of police incompetence, but looking back, it feels more like a tragedy of scale. They were trying to catch a modern predator with medieval tools, drowning in a sea of information that they had no way to organize. The killer wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was hiding in the light of the fluorescent lamps, nestled between the alphabetized dividers of a filing cabinet that was too heavy for the building to hold. As we move into the final chapters of this long shadow, we see a man who was interviewed 9 times and walked away every single time, leaving the paper to pile higher and higher. The air in Sheffield on the night of January 2nd, 1981, was a biting, crystalline cold that seemed to hang motionless over the streets of the Broomhill district. It was a Friday evening, just after 10:50 p.m., and the holiday season was beginning to exhale its final, weary breath. The world felt muffled, as if the frost thickening on the pavement was absorbing the sound of the city. In a marked police car, 2 officers, Sergeant Robert Ring and a young probationary constable named Robert Hyde, were navigating the quiet, tree-lined thoroughfares of Melbourne Avenue. Their heater hummed a low, steady drone against the freezing darkness outside, the rhythmic sweep of the wipers clearing a thin veil of mist from the windshield. They were on a routine patrol, the kind that usually ends with nothing more than a few notes on a clipboard and the quiet satisfaction of a shift nearly completed. As they rounded a bend, the beams of their headlights swept across the imposing architecture of a building known as Light Trades House. It was a grand, detached structure, the headquarters of local craftsmen, and at this hour it should have been entirely deserted. But something caught Sergeant Ring's eye. Tucked away in the shadows of the building's private driveway was a car. It was a brown Rover 3500, its dark paint gleaming faintly under the streetlights. The vehicle was reversed deep into the drive, facing outward as if ready for a quick departure. To the experienced eyes of the officers, it looked out of place. This was a quiet, affluent area, and the sight of a lone vehicle idling in a dark driveway during the middle of winter suggested something was amiss. They pulled their patrol car over, the tires crunching softly on the frozen grit, and prepared to investigate what they assumed would be a simple case of a motorist and a companion seeking a bit of late-night privacy. The officers stepped out into the sharp night air, their breath blooming in white clouds before them. As they approached the Rover, the driver rolled down his window, and a faint plume of exhaust curled into the darkness. Inside sat a man with a dark, neatly trimmed beard and intense, deep-set eyes. Beside him was a 24-year-old woman named Olivia Reivers. Constable Hyde leaned toward the window, his voice calm but professional, asking the driver for his name and his business in the driveway. The man was composed, remarkably so. He told them his name was Peter Williams and gestured toward Olivia, claiming quite simply that she was his girlfriend. But the officers were not so easily convinced. Sergeant Ring noticed the woman's demeanor, recognizing her from previous encounters in the city's red light districts. The narrative the man was weaving, the quiet couple out for a late-night talk, began to fray at the edges almost immediately. While Hyde continued the questioning, Sergeant Ring walked to the rear of the Rover. He shone his flashlight onto the registration plate, the beam reflecting brightly off the yellow surface. The plate read DHY285T. It looked legitimate enough to the naked eye, but the police radio soon told a different story. When they called in a check to the national computer, the results came back with a startling discrepancy. Those plates did not belong to a brown Rover 3500. They were registered to a completely different make of car, a Skoda. The realization shifted the energy of the encounter instantly. This was no longer just a routine welfare check on a parked car. It was now a stop involving a vehicle with false identification. The man in the driver's seat, the man who called himself Peter Williams, was now under suspicion of theft. The officers informed him that they would have to take him and his passenger to the station for further questioning. It was at this moment that a peculiar request broke the tension. The driver looked at the officers and claimed he was absolutely bursting for a pee. He asked if he could step behind the building for a moment before they left. Perhaps it was his polite, soft-spoken manner, or perhaps the officers were preoccupied with the woman in the passenger seat, but they allowed him a moment of privacy. They watched as he walked away into the shadows toward a large oil storage tank nestled against a brick wall. In the silence of the night, Sergeant Ring heard a strange, metallic scuffling sound, like something heavy striking the ground. When the man returned a minute later, he seemed even more relaxed, brushing a bit of dust from his coat. When asked about the noise, he laughed it off, saying he had simply tripped and fallen off the wall in the dark. At the time, it seemed like a trivial detail, a clumsy man in a dark driveway, but it was a moment that would soon haunt the investigation. The drive to the Hamerton Road police station was quiet. The man sat in the back of the patrol car, staring out at the darkened streets of Sheffield as they passed. He was cooperative, almost strangely helpful, as if he were just a regular citizen caught in a minor bureaucratic misunderstanding. He didn't know that back at the driveway of Light Trade's house, the frost was settling over the secret he had just discarded. He didn't know that the officers were already noting how his physical appearance, the dark, curly hair, the specific shape of his beard, and those piercing eyes, bore a haunting resemblance to the descriptions that had been circulated for years across the north of England. The shadow of the Yorkshire Ripper had loomed over every police station for half a decade, and though they didn't say it aloud yet, a cold realization was beginning to dawn on the two officers in the front seat. Upon arrival at the station, the suspect made a second request to use the facilities. Again, he was granted permission. Inside the small, sterile bathroom, he moved with a frantic but focused precision. He reached into his clothing and produced a sharp knife, which he quickly and clumsily tried to hide within the ceramic cistern of the toilet. He believed he was clearing himself of the evidence that would tie him to the horrors of the past 5 years. When he emerged, he was searched more thoroughly. In his pockets, they found a length of blue and pink cord. In the glove compartment of his car, 3 screwdrivers were tucked away. To any other officer on any other night, these might have been the tools of a common thief or a handyman. But in the context of the man's mounting lies and the false plates, they felt like pieces of a much darker puzzle. The man who had been arrested for a simple traffic offense was about to become the center of the most significant interrogation in British criminal history. As the sun began to rise over Sheffield the following morning, the significance of the arrest started to ripple through the department. Sergeant Ring couldn't shake the memory of that scuffling sound by the oil tank. He felt a nagging sensation in the back of his mind, a hunch that the man's fall had been something else entirely. While the suspect sat in a holding cell, still maintaining his calm facade, Ring decided to return to Melbourne Avenue. He arrived back at the driveway of Light Trade's house, the morning light gray and somber. He walked to the exact spot where the man had disappeared into the shadows. There, lying on a bed of frozen leaves behind the oil tank, was a heavy ball-peen hammer and a second knife. They lay there, cold and discarded, the silent witnesses to a 5-year reign of terror that was finally, after so much blood and so many tears, coming to a sudden and quiet end in a Sheffield driveway. The transfer from the holding cells in Sheffield to the interrogation rooms in Dewsbury was a journey through a landscape that Peter Sutcliffe knew better than almost any man alive. As the police vehicle hummed along the northern motorways, the gray light of January 1981 filtered through the windows, casting long, pale shadows across the interior. To the officers sitting beside him, he was a man caught with stolen number plates, a minor criminal who had been found in the wrong place at the wrong time. But as they crossed the border into West Yorkshire, the air seemed to grow heavier. This was the territory he had navigated for years behind the wheel of a heavy goods vehicle, a labyrinth of side streets and industrial estates where he had felt invisible. Now, for the first time, he was not the one watching from the elevated cab of his lorry. He was the one being watched, and the quiet dignity he tried to maintain was beginning to fray at the very edges of his composure. Inside the station at Dewsbury, the atmosphere was a sharp contrast to the biting cold outside. The corridors smelled of floor wax, damp wool coats, and the acidic tang of overbrewed tea. Peter was led into a small, windowless interview room where the fluorescent lights hummed with a persistent, low-frequency buzz. He sat down, a short, dark-haired man with deep-set eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. To anyone passing by, he looked like exactly what he claimed to be. A hard-working husband from Bingley, a man who spent his days hauling goods across the country and his evenings at home with his wife, Sonia. He spoke in a soft, polite Yorkshire accent, his voice rarely rising above a gentle murmur. He was cooperative, almost helpful, answering questions about his work and his car with a calm that felt eerily natural. He had been through this before, after all. Over the last 5 years, he had been interviewed 9 separate times by the police, and each time he had walked away. Detectives John Boyle and Peter Gilrain sat across from him, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a half-decade-long hunt. They watched his hands, which remained mostly still on the table. They talked about the mundane details first, the theft of the plates from a scrapyard, and his upcoming court date for a drink-driving offense. Peter explained his actions with a humble, self-deprecating logic, portraying himself as a man who had simply made a foolish mistake to save his livelihood. He spoke of the pressures of his job at the haulage firm and the quiet life he led at number 6 Garden Lane. He was a master of the ordinary, a man who could disappear into the background of any room. For several hours, the mask held firm. He was just a lorry driver from Bingley, a quiet man caught in a web of minor indiscretions. But while he sat in that warm, yellow-lit room, the outside world was closing in on the secrets he had left behind in the Sheffield dirt. The turning point arrived not with a shout, but with a quiet message delivered to the detectives. Sergeant Ring, the officer who had made the initial arrest, had returned to the scene at Melbourne Avenue in the light of day. There, behind an oil storage tank where Peter had requested a moment of privacy to relieve himself, the sergeant had found something that changed everything. He discovered a ball-peen hammer and a sharp knife, discarded among the fallen leaves and winter debris. Later, word would arrive of another knife hidden within the toilet cistern at the Sheffield station. When the detectives returned to the interview room in Dewsbury, the energy had shifted. They no longer spoke of stolen plates or traffic violations. They began to speak of the shadows that had haunted the North since 1975. They laid the reality of the weapons on the table, not physically, but through the weight of their words, watching for the flicker of a reaction in the man behind the wheel. The silence in the room became absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall and the distant sound of a typewriter in another office. Peter Sutcliffe looked at the men across from him, and for a moment, the ordinary facade seemed to dissolve. The psychological pressure of 5 years of double living, of the voices he claimed to hear, and the sheer impossibility of explaining away the hammer and the knife began to crush his resolve. He knew that the many times he had been eliminated from the inquiry were over. He knew that the luck which had protected him through dozens of near misses had finally run dry. He took a slow, deep breath, his dark eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the detectives. The quiet man from Bingley, the faithful husband, the reliable driver, was being replaced by something else, something far older and more terrifying that had lived within him for a long, long time. It was at approximately mid-afternoon on January 4th, 1981, that the final wall came down. Peter leaned forward slightly, his voice still soft, still polite, but carrying a chilling clarity that would echo through the history of British crime. He looked at Detective Inspector Boyle and said, "It is all right, I know what you are leading up to. The Yorkshire Ripper. It is me. I killed all those women." The admission was so sudden, so direct, that it seemed to hang in the air like a physical weight. There was no grandiosity in his tone, only a flat, matter-of-fact exhaustion. In that single moment, the greatest manhunt in the history of the country reached its end. The man who had spent years driving the dark motorways, watching the world from his cab and choosing his moments with predatory patience, had finally stepped out of the cab and into the light of justice. What followed was a confession that spanned 24 hours and filled over 50 handwritten pages. With a terrifyingly precise memory, Peter began to recount the details of 13 murders and 7 attempted attacks. He spoke of his movements, his methods, and the strange, divine mission he believed he was on. He asked for his wife, Sonia, to be brought to the station so he could tell her himself, a final gesture of the family man he still believed himself to be. As he wrote and spoke, the investigators realized the scale of the horror they had finally cornered. The man behind the wheel had not just been a driver of goods, but a driver of fear, a ghost who had haunted the streets of Leeds, Bradford, and Manchester. As the sun set over Dewsbury that Sunday evening, the city began to wake up to the news that the shadow was gone. But for the man in the interview room, the journey was only just beginning. The air inside the No. 1 court at the Old Bailey in May 1981 was heavy, thick with the scent of floor wax and the weight of 5 long years of terror. Outside, the streets of London hummed with the energy of spring, but within these oak-paneled walls, time seemed to slow to a crawl. The light filtered through the high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced over the mahogany benches, where journalists and families sat in a shared, breathless silence. This was the final stage of a journey that had begun on the dark moors and wet streets of the north. The global gaze was fixed upon the dock, where a man with a dark, manicured beard sat perfectly still, his eyes often downcast. The trial was not a question of who had committed these acts, for the confessions had already been written in ink and signed. Instead, the court was tasked with a deeper, more troubling question: the state of a human soul and the nature of responsibility. Sir Michael Havers, the Attorney General, stood before the jury of 6 men and 6 women. His voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the disturbing details he was forced to recount. The defense argued that the man in the dock was a victim of his own mind, a paranoid schizophrenic who believed he was on a divine mission from God, a mission he claimed began in a cemetery in Bingley. They spoke of voices and a destiny that overrode his will. But the prosecution painted a different, more chilling portrait. They described a calculated, methodical predator who had hidden his true nature behind the wheel of a truck and the domesticity of a quiet marriage. The jury listened as the medical experts debated the boundary between madness and malice. They heard how the defendant had allegedly joked about deceiving the doctors to avoid a life behind bars. The tension in the room was a physical thing, a tightening in the chest of everyone present as they weighed the claims of a divine mission against the brutal reality of 13 lives extinguished. When the verdict finally came after hours of deliberation, it fell like a rhythmic hammer blow. Guilty. 13 times the word echoed for the murders, 7 times more for the attempted murders. The defendant remained impassive, his expression as cold as the iron bars that would soon define his world. Mr. Justice Boreham, draped in his judicial robes, spoke with a gravity that seemed to anchor the entire room to the floor. He noted that the man before him was a person of great evil, and that the sheer scale of the suffering he had caused was almost beyond human comprehension. He sentenced him to 20 concurrent terms of life imprisonment, recommending a minimum of 30 years. The sentence was a formal end to the legal proceedings, but for the families in the gallery, the finality brought a complex mix of relief and an enduring, hollow ache that no courtroom could ever truly fill. The man who had haunted the nightmares of millions was finally consigned to the shadows. As the case closed, the focus shifted to the long shadow of the investigation itself. In the following year, the Byford report would lay bare the catastrophic failures of the hunt. It was a story of a system overwhelmed by its own weight. We must imagine the police incident rooms filled with mountains of paper, over 5 million index cards that had become a labyrinth where the truth was lost. The investigators had interviewed the killer 9 separate times, yet each time he had slipped back into the night because the information was not connected, like fragments of a mirror that no one knew how to assemble. Most tragic of all was the distraction of the hoaxer known as Wareside Jack. The police had focused so much energy on a voice from a tape and the handwriting on letters from Sunderland that they ignored the man right in front of them who did not match that profile. The report described these as serious errors of judgment, a reminder of how easily a trail can grow cold when one follows a ghost instead of the evidence. But as we let the technical details of the trial and the reports fade, let us turn our thoughts to the women who were so much more than names in a case file. We remember Wilma McCann and Emily Jackson, who were mothers first. We think of the young students like Barbara Leach and Jacqueline Hill, whose futures were bright and full of potential. We remember Josephine Whittaker, a 19-year-old building society worker, and Jane MacDonald, only 16, whose lives were just beginning to blossom. For too long, the narrative of this case was focused on the labels assigned to them by a society that often judged the vulnerable. Tonight, we reclaim their dignity. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and dreamers. Their legacy is not the violence that took them, but the love they left behind and the way their stories eventually forced a change in how we seek justice. They are the light that remains after the darkness of those years has finally been pushed back. The long road to justice has ended. The sirens that once wailed through the streets of West Yorkshire have been silenced, replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the steady rhythm of a world that has moved on, though it never forgets. The weight of the past is heavy, but you do not have to carry it. The courtroom is empty, the papers are filed away, and the night is still. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.